Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Rails Coach Podcast. Sorry, I got it mixed up again. This is your host, Charles Max Wood, and this week we're going to be talking about debugging your Rails application. Now, before I get started, I want to let you all know that I am looking for a sponsor for this podcast. If you're interested, give me a call, 801-367-6164. I would also really like to find out what you're thinking with this podcast, and know which episodes you like and you don't like, and what you think I could change or do to better help you learn how to program in Ruby on Rails. Now, before I get going too far, I also want to let you know that I'm going to have a Ruby on Rails beginner's course available within the next few weeks. I just need to wrap a few things up on the sign-up site, and then we should be able to move ahead from there. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to email me. I've gotten a few emails from a few other people already wanting to know when the next course is starting, and so I'll let you know, and we can kind of move in from there. Now, as far as debugging in Ruby on Rails goes, I was working with a client about 6 months ago, maybe, and one of their developers, they kept handing me bugs that they couldn't figure out how to fix. And I would fix them within like a day. And they, one of the developers, he finally came to me, he's like, dude, what are you doing? How are you finding these bugs? And the reason that he was asking was that his text editor obviously wasn't telling him where the bugs were. And I was just using a standard text editor. I was using TextMate at the time, and TextMate doesn't have any debugging tools built into it. A lot of the IDEs do, and if you're using an IDE, most of these IDEs actually hook into one of the debugger libraries for Ruby, and anyway, so that all works out fine. But he's like, how are you tracking this down? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I debug in Ruby on Rails. First of all, you're going to need a gem. I use the Ruby debug gem, Ruby-debug. If you're using Ruby 1-9 or 1.9, then you want Ruby-debug 1.9. They work a little bit differently, but they do basically the same thing. We also on the Ruby Rogues podcast, and we're also incidentally going to be talking about debugging on the Ruby Rogues podcast this afternoon. If you're What am I saying? Oh, yeah. On the Ruby Rogues podcast, Greg Brown brought up the library Pry, which is kind of like IRB, except it has a few more features and stuff. All of these work well. The basic concept is that when you hit a breakpoint in your code, and with Ruby Debug, you simply insert a breakpoint by typing in debugger. And what it does is it'll halt your program and give you a command line interface so that you can interact with your application in the state that it's in at that point. And that's really the point usually with these debuggers is they stop your application where you think the error might be occurring. In other words, where you put the breakpoint in. And so it allows you to step through your application and see where things start to go wrong. The other thing that it does is that you can also get information about the state that your application is in. So, for example, in the case of a Rails request, if you put your debugger line or your breakpoint in your controller, then when you run the request, it'll actually halt, and in where your script server is running, you can go in and there you'll have a little command line interface. And so what you can do is you can start doing a print. So you do p space, and then you type in the information that you want. So if you want the value of an instance variable, you do p space at user, or whatever your instance variable is, and then you can get that information and you can use it to start debugging your application. So what this does is it gives you kind of a freeze frame view so that you can figure out where exactly the problems are occurring. So you can say, oh well, this value is going in here, this value is going in here, and so these values should come back out. So you step through and you realize, okay, well, the right value went in, but the wrong value went out, so it looks like the problem's in here. So the next time you go through it, you step down to where you're sending the input into this method, and then you just step into that method, which in Ruby Debug, I believe, is S, and it'll step into that method and show you what's going on under the covers, so to speak. So, let's say that you have some method that sorts your results in a certain way. and you're getting the order mixed up somehow. So you do S, and it steps into that sort method, and it starts to figure out, you can start stepping through it and seeing where the misorder, the misordering is going, and then you can fix it from there. You can't edit and save from Ruby Debug, but you just go in, change the file, and then run it from there. You can also move your breakpoints around to kind of see where things are at that way. Now, my understanding is that Pry gives you a little more verbose or a little more easy to use output. With Ruby Debug, you have to print everything, which is still better, since you are kind of within the context of your app, is still better than putting a put-s statement in to figure out where things are at and then running it a million times. It goes much faster doing it the other way. So anyway, those are kind of some thoughts that I have. Basically, I guess the main points here are get something that allows you to put a breakpoint in. At the breakpoint, then query the state of things, and then once you're convinced that the state that things are in is correct, where the breakpoint is, then step through step by step until you see things go wrong. At the point where you see things go wrong, then what you want to do is go through the same process again, except step into where things are going wrong and continue to move through things until you can see the problem. It really works out well that way. A lot of the IDEs do this for you, and they'll step through the code in the file so that you can just change it right there, which is something that's kind of nice. And they also give you kind of a full readout. The problem that I have with the IDEs is that they run a whole lot more stuff than I actually need most of the time. So 95 to 99% of the time, when I'm running an IDE, it's just doing extra processing in the background that slows things down for me, gets in my way, and ultimately doesn't solve any problems for me. So I usually use a text editor and the Ruby debug library. But if an IDE works for you, then that works as well. You just set the breakpoint, do the same thing. If you have any questions for me, you can email me, Chuck at teachmetocode.com. You can also find me online on Twitter at twitter.com/cmaxw. And I recently actually had somebody add me as a friend on Facebook. Now, I play a few games on Facebook, so it's kind of noisy, but if you want to connect with me on Facebook, you can. I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/CharlesMaxWood. You can also get stuff that I've been building on GitHub, github.com/CharlesMaxWood. And if you want to hire me to help you learn Ruby on Rails or to build something for you in Ruby on Rails, feel free. You can find me at Chuck at teachmetocode, or you can call me at 801-367-6164. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next week. This is Ruby Rogues, your playbook for programming in Rails.